It's 1876. The United States sends its golden boy, George Custer, to crush Sitting Bull's resistance in Montana. But as the general reaches the top of a hill, he sees far more tents than he expected. Custer doesn't flinch, however. He smiles and raises his hat and yells, "Hurrah, boys! We've got them!" What he doesn't realize is that he's walking into one of the largest Native American war camps ever assembled, and reinforcements aren't coming to save him. Just 1 hour later, and every one of his men is dead. Custer's name becomes synonymous not for glory, but for one of the largest catastrophes in American military history. But how did things go so terribly wrong? This is the unbelievable story of Custer's last stand. George Custer was a farmer's son out of Ohio. He was a uniquely ambitious person. He craved glory and a place in the history books. As a boy, he was sharp, bold, and proud. He entered West Point in 1857, where he was written up 726 times for bad behavior, the most of any West Point cadet before him. But his instructors and fellow classmates couldn't deny that the troublemaker had the makings of an excellent soldier. The Civil War arrived to give Custer a chance to prove just that. Custer was a brilliant officer, winning multiple victories over the course of the war, and always leading his men from the front. He gained a reputation for charging in where no other man would dare to go. He'd never ask a man to do what he wouldn't do alongside him. His soldiers adored him, and his superiors were so impressed that at 23 years old, he became one of the youngest generals in U.S. history. The press dubbed him the Boy General. Soon, everyone knew about brave General Custer with his flamboyant style and iconic long golden hair. On July 3, 1863, Custer and his men held the Union line at the Battle of Gettysburg. Riding at the front in full officer's gear, Custer charged into the Confederate troops at a critical moment and shifted the tide of the battle in the Union's favor. His exemplary service continued until the very last day of the war. The table upon which Robert E. Lee signed his surrender, and which was later gifted to Custer's wife, noted that no man had done more to secure this surrender than your husband. After the war, Custer was assigned to lead the 7th Cavalry to deal with the Plains Indians. He hated the assignment and felt that it denied him any chances for glory. It would take until 1868 for him to find another chance to seize the glory that he so desired. In its relentless march westward, the United States had set its sights on the Black Hills. The Sioux, who had already lived there, were not keen to let them have it. In April 1868, the Sioux and the U.S. signed the Fort Laramie Treaty. It gave the Sioux full rights to the Black Hills, but only if they stopped attacking settlers and stayed on a reservation. But the U.S. never intended to honor the treaty. The Black Hills were too valuable, and they expected that an influx of settlers would provoke the Sioux into violating the treaty soon enough. Unaware of this deception, most Sioux agreed to the deal. One who didn't was Chief Sitting Bull. He was Lakota, one of the two great subdivisions of the Sioux, and he refused to accept the treaty. Sitting Bull believed that the U.S. would inevitably push onto their lands regardless, and that resistance was the only way to preserve their way of life. Sitting Bull was nothing like Custer. Where Custer was bold and reckless, Sitting Bull was calm and careful. His name came from his habit of thinking before acting. But he wasn't just a war leader. He was also a spiritual figure. He claimed to have even seen visions of the Great Spirit, which guided him to defeat the Americans. He rallied many fellow Lakota to his cause, as well as members of the nearby Cheyenne people and several smaller groups. Sitting Bull assembled a coalition of nomadic raiders to fight off American encroachment, working closely with his friend and right hand, another Lakota named Gall. They launched raids on American settlements and on rival Native American groups like the Crow and the Arikara. Sitting Bull's coalition began attacking U.S. settlements in the months following Fort Laramie. The United States needed someone brave and talented to stop Sitting Bull. They needed George Custer. Custer was sent with the 7th Cavalry in October of 1868. Winter was coming, and that's when they were most vulnerable. Setting off along the Washita River in Oklahoma, Custer picked up the trail of a Cheyenne camp on November 26th. At dawn on the 27th, He led his men in a charge through the camp, cutting down everyone they could find. Some were Cheyenne warriors, but most were women and children. His second-in-command, Major Joel Elliott, took 20 men to pursue the fleeing Cheyenne, and Custer finished up in the camp. 103 Cheyenne were killed, and Custer saw it as a glorious success. However, Custer's personal ambitions had once again gotten in the way. First, the village he hit belonged to a Cheyenne chief friendly to the U.S., making peace with the Cheyenne nearly impossible. Secondly, it was only one village among dozens along the river, and word quickly spread upriver to the other Cheyenne villages, which forced Custer to withdraw as quickly as he could. This led on to the third problem. Major Joel Elliott hadn't come back. With the rest of the Cheyenne villages now mobilizing, Custer decided not to wait for him. Major Elliott and the bodies of all his men were found weeks later. Many men in the 7th Cavalry blamed Custer for their deaths. Captain Frederick Benteen was the loudest critic. He wrote a letter blaming Custer for Elliott's death. The letter leaked to the press, and Custer was furious. Though Benteen stayed under his command, they never forgave each other. Custer's victory at Washita revived his popularity. Now recast as a hero of the American West, Custer spent the next several years continuing to lead the 7th Cavalry against the Indians. In 1873, he was moved permanently to Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota, where he could better respond to Sitting Bull and his resistance against the Americans. Two more important characters entered his story at this point. First, Major Marcus Reno joined Custer's staff as one of his most important officers. Reno was an irritable man with a terrible whiskey habit, and much like Captain Benteen, he found Custer to be insufferable and arrogant. Fortunately for Custer, he could surround himself with other people under his command to counter the critics like Benteen and Reno. His brothers, Tom and Boston, joined him, along with his brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun, and even his wife relocated to Fort Abraham Lincoln to be with him. Custer's allies weren't just white Americans, though. In 1873, a half-Sioux, half-Arikara scout named Bloody Knife was assigned to Custer's unit, and the two men became good friends. Not every Native American agreed with Sitting Bull. Bloody Knife had a particular bone to pick with him. He'd known Sitting Bull in the past, but had always been mistreated by him. He especially hated Gall, Sitting Bull's right-hand man, who had bullied Bloody Knife as a child. Childhood rivalry had turned tragic. Bloody Knife almost killed Gall in a fight, while Gall later killed Bloody Knife's brothers and son in separate raids. Custer was the natural choice to lead an expedition into the Black Hills in 1874. Officially, it was to find a site for a fort to stop Sitting Bull. In reality, its main goal was to find gold in the Black Hills and act as a massive propaganda campaign to inspire a wave of prospectors and settlers to rush there. The expedition was more of a tour than a military campaign. They encountered no serious resistance, and Custer spent more bullets hunting with his brothers and Bloody Knife than he did fighting Indians. Photographers and news reporters following the expedition published stories and images of Custer's exciting frontier adventure and the successful discovery of gold. Custer's expedition triggered a gold rush. By late 1875, 15,000 white settlers had flooded into the region. Officially, since they were independent settlers, it wasn't the U.S. government's fault, and so it didn't violate the Fort Laramie Treaty. Unofficially, President Ulysses S. Grant fully supported them and was just waiting for Sitting Bull and the Lakota to respond with more violence and give him an excuse to seize the Black Hills entirely. Washington made one last appeal to the Sioux to sell the Black Hills peacefully in September 1875. Sitting Bull's warnings that the Americans would always come for the land proved true. The Sioux rejected the deal, so the president drew his line in the sand. Any Lakota or Cheyenne who refused to move on to U.S. reservations by January of 1876 would be considered hostile. It was an impossible demand. The ultimatum was only given in November of 1875, when winter was already in full swing. Even if people wanted to obey, they would freeze to death trying to do so. It was injustice, plain and simple. The expedition to pursue Sitting Bull and his hostile Indians departed Fort Abraham Lincoln on May 17, 1876. Ultimate authority on the expedition rested with General Alfred Terry, a friend and supporter of Custer. Scouting reports said that Sitting Bull had gathered his followers along the Yellowstone River, specifically in a stretch where 4 lesser rivers joined it: the Powder, the Tongue, the Rosebud, and the Bighorn. Terry and Custer would lead the bulk of the army westward along the Yellowstone out of Dakota. A second force under General John Gibbon would approach from Montana in the west, while a third under General George Crook would come up from Wyoming in the south. The goal was to cut off all avenues of escape and trap the Indians between the armies like a bunch of herded cattle. Custer treated it like another jolly expedition. Even Terry got annoyed with Custer's frequent diversions to go hunting or exploring with his brothers. Major Reno and Captain Benteen were just as fed up. Reno was relieved when Terry sent him out on a recon expedition down the Rosebud River for a few days, where he managed to pick up Sitting Bull's trail. Reno rushed back with the information, but Custer called him a coward for not pursuing it. Hot on Sitting Bull's trail, there was no time for the two men to argue. Terry decided to split his forces again. He would link up with Gibbon's Montana troops and then go down the Bighorn River from the north. Custer would instead go south and follow that trail across the Rosebud. They had a good idea of where Sitting Bull would be now. If Custer encountered Sitting Bull, he was to swing around south and wait for Terry and Gibbon to arrive from the north. Of course, given Custer's reputation, expecting him to wait was like expecting a starving dog to ignore the meal in front of his face. Everyone expected Custer to go for glory the moment it was dangled in front of him. "Custer, don't be greedy. Leave some for us," was the last thing they told him before he left. "No," he replied, "I will not." The Americans were right. Sitting Bull and his Indians were exactly where they thought they would be. Following President Grant's ultimatum earlier that year, Sitting Bull had gathered thousands more warriors. They knew the Americans would come, and numbers were their only chance of surviving it. If they failed, this could be their last summer as free nomads on the plains. Sitting Bull's message traveled far and wide, gathering around 8,000 people to his cause. Gall continued to serve as his closest advisor, but he also gained new excellent followers too. Of these, Crazy Horse stood out. A member of a different branch of the Lakota, Crazy Horse was young, energetic, and utterly fearless. Like Sitting Bull, he claimed to have visions that gave him great power, which was where he had gotten his name from. It was Crazy Horse who first encountered the American troops marching against them that summer. On June 17th, General Crook's men from Wyoming were camped along the Rosebud River when Crazy Horse's scouts saw them. With 1,500 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors at his back, Crazy Horse did the unthinkable and charged at an American army of roughly equal size to his own. Historically, the Indians needed far more men to win an open battle. Crazy Horse proved to be the exception. He ordered his men to skirt the Americans in every direction, to never give them a moment to breathe. One rider charged in from the left and another from the right, so that the Americans wouldn't know when or where to shoot. Only the timely intervention of Crook's Crow and Shoshone scouts gave Crook the chance to retreat after losing 30 men. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull had won an almost unthinkable victory over the Americans in open battle. Crook was shaken and quickly wrote back to his superiors about the most impressive combat display from Indians he'd ever seen. Critically, he did not send a message up to Custer or Terry. Now knowing American troops were closing in, Sitting Bull ordered his people to a new campsite. 8,000 Lakota and Cheyenne followed him to what they called the Valley of the Greasy Grass. They pitched their tents in the shadow of the hills alongside the Little Bighorn River, which fed into the main Bighorn a few miles to the north. There they celebrated the traditional Sundance as they always had. It was said that Sitting Bull was struck with another vision during that Sundance. He saw American soldiers in their hundreds falling down into the Indian camp. Sitting Bull took it as a sign that a great victory was about to be won. Meanwhile, Custer's men had pursued Sitting Bull's trail over the Rosebud and up the hills on the far side towards the Bighorn River. They had no idea about Crook's disaster several days earlier. Bloody Knife and the rest of the scouts noted that the trail suggested many more Indians than Custer expected, perhaps thousands of them. Bloody Knife warned Custer that they might be too many to fight alone, and they should wait for Terry and Gibbon before attacking. Just after dawn on June 25th, Custer's scouts climbed the hills a few miles east of the Little Bighorn, where they spotted the columns of smoke coming from Sitting Bull's camp. There was no question in Custer's mind. Today was the day of glory. Custer had 700 men split between 12 companies. One company stayed behind to guard their supplies, but the rest would go to battle. Custer would take 5 of them across the river to attack the camp from the north. Major Reno took 3 to attack from the south, with Bloody Knife helping to scout the route. Captain Benteen would take the remaining 3 and swing further south around Reno before coming up and joining the battle on the camp's western flank. Custer couldn't have been thrilled to have to rely on 2 men that he hated, but all the men he did trust, like his brothers Tom and Boston and his brother-in-law Lieutenant Calhoun, were already with him. Custer moved north, hiding behind hills to stay out of sight until the last possible moment. At last, around 3:30 p.m., he crested the final ridgeline overlooking the camp and saw thousands of tents stretching over 3 miles. There were many more than he expected. He quickly scribbled down some orders. "Benteen, come on. Big village, come quick. Bring packs, and sent a rider to bring it to the captain. Never one to wait, though, Custer decided to charge ahead anyway. The boy general waved his hat above his head and cheered, "Hurrah, boys, we've got them!" Then he charged down the hill. To the south, Major Reno's forces had crossed the river and were approaching the camp with 150 men. Bloody Knife and the scouts were the first to encounter Lakota and Cheyenne warriors on the outskirts of the camp. This was the first warning that Sitting Bull's people had that they were under attack. As was tradition, Sitting Bull and Gull occupied the southern part of the camp and were the first to be hit by Reno's soldiers. As soon as Reno encountered the first resistance, he ordered his men to dismount and form a firing line. Bullets whistled into the camp, striking men, women, and children alike. Sitting Bull's first instinct was to protect his people. He ordered his nephew and another warrior to rush to the south and try to negotiate with the attackers. Both men were shot. Sitting Bull mounted his horse, only for an American bullet to shoot it out from under him. That was the last straw. "They have shot my favorite horse. It is like they have shot me. Attack them!" Gull and Crazy Horse led the counterattack in the south. Reno was completely unprepared for any coordinated resistance, and the Indians were able to stop Reno in his tracks. Survivors revealed that Reno had been drinking all day, which affected his judgment. Reno and Bloody Knife tried to strategize their next move. The Lakota world was small, and some of those fighting would surely have recognized Bloody Knife beside Reno. He was an obvious target. Reno was halfway through a sentence when a bullet struck Bloody Knife in the back of the head. He died instantly, his blood and brains spraying over the drunken major's face. Bloody Knife's death shattered Reno's resolve, and he sounded the retreat. "Any of you wish to make your escape, follow me!" Order collapsed as Reno's men rushed back across the river. Men abandoned their horses and guns as they scrambled through the water and up the steep banks. The Indians only had to stand on the other side and shoot them. Up on the hills to the southeast, Benteen had heard the commotion and came back to investigate. As he waited on the hilltop, Reno scrambled up the hillside with a handful of his surviving men. "For God's sake, Benteen, halt your command and help me! I've lost half my men!" Benteen frowned and had but one question. "Where is Custer?" Reno had no answer. Benteen could only shake his head. He had seen this before. "It's another Major Elliott affair," he sighed, remembering the encounter at Washita all those years ago. Custer had abandoned them once again to chase glory, or so Benteen later claimed. The fact that Benteen, Reno, and his men could hear the gunfire raging in the direction that Custer had gone suggests that something else was going on. Benteen received the written order from Custer to come and help him, but he ignored it. Instead, Benteen and Reno sat atop the hill for the next 2 hours until the gunfire faded and one of Benteen's infuriated captains went out to investigate for himself. What he found shocked him. We don't know exactly what happened to Custer after he charged down the hill. The following is the best account of what happened at Custer's last stand. Custer assembled his men atop a hill later known as Calhoun Hill to survey the situation and wait for Benteen. Custer had a habit of taking Indian hostages to force the rest to surrender. It's likely that he wanted to repeat that plan. His men would cross the Little Bighorn into the camp, capture as many women and children as they could, and force Sitting Bull to submit in order to save them. It was a simple matter of charging down the hill and fording the river. Custer would have led his men from the front. The sight of Custer and his men would have been terrifying. Even Sitting Bull, when he first heard of Custer's attack from the north, was afraid. "We thought we were whipped," he said. But Cheyenne and Lakota warriors were concealed on the far side of the river and opened fire on the Americans. By now, Crazy Horse and the rest of the camp's warriors had broken off from chasing Reno and were rushing to deal with Custer. Custer had underestimated their numbers. The Americans began to retreat back up the hill. Lieutenant Calhoun and his company secured themselves atop of one hill that now bears his name. Custer, his brother, and most of the rest fell back to what is now appropriately called Last Stand Hill. Based on the bodies, half of Calhoun's force never made it back to his hill. Within minutes, Crazy Horse had led a band of mounted Indians to encircle them from behind as the bulk of the Indians pursued them up the slopes. Calhoun's men were overwhelmed, and every last man was killed. By the time his brother-in-law's position was overrun, Custer must have known that Benteen was not coming with the troops that he'd asked for. Thousands of Indians spreading over the hills around him, engulfing what little remained of his men. The last of Custer's men were cut down around him, slain by a storm of arrows and bullets flying around them. It was so chaotic that some of the Indians accidentally killed each other. No one is sure who was the last one standing, but Sitting Bull later revealed what his warriors had told him. It was said that up there where the last fight took place, where the last stand was made, the long hair stood like a sheaf of corn with all the ears fallen around him. Custer's last stand may have been the last of them all. Soon after the gunfire from Custer's direction went silent, Benteen and Reno found themselves surrounded at their position, now called Reno Hill. Their 400 men dug in and held off the Indians through the night of the 25th. Only at sunset on the 26th, when scouts sighted Terry and Gibbon arriving from the north, did Sitting Bull order his people to withdraw. General Terry arrived shortly after. His first question was the same one that Benteen had asked Reno. "Where's Custer?" The bodies of 200 men from 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry were found where they had fallen the day before. Some had been scalped and mutilated by the Indians. It was Benteen who, walking among the corpses, was urgently called over by a private to inspect one body in particular. 2 bullet wounds, one in the chest and one in the head. "My God, it's him!" On July 6, 1876, news reached the 7th Cavalry's headquarters at Fort Abraham Lincoln of Custer's disastrous defeat. Within days, everyone in the country knew about the disaster at Little Bighorn. Days earlier, on July 4, 1876, America had celebrated its centenary. It was a moment of optimism and hope, of celebrating the progress made and the progress yet to come. It was a moment to celebrate America's heroes like Custer, who was out fighting those barbarous backwoods Indians that very moment. Custer's death should have been impossible. Americans had seen themselves as untouchable and unstoppable forces of civilization. When word reached them that Indians had slain a hero like Custer and 268 men in open battle, most Americans couldn't wrap their heads around it. Some blamed Custer's foolishness. He was always rushing headlong into danger for his own glory, and it finally caught up with him. Many blamed Benteen and Reno, who had ignored Custer's orders and sat on their laurels complaining as his men were slaughtered. Surprisingly, few credited the outcome to Sitting Bull and his Indians, who had proven themselves as incredible warriors twice over. America had sent its best against them and lost. Sitting Bull was ready for whatever they sent next.